My friends and I had planned a backpacking trip after graduation. I arrived a day earlier than everyone else after finding a cheaper flight. Spending one night alone didn't seem like a big deal. So I booked a hostel in the older part of the city and planned to meet my friends the next afternoon. The hostel was tucked between narrow streets and historic buildings. By the time I arrived, the sun had already set, and the city was somewhat still alive, with people in the streets. Inside, the hostel felt warm and welcoming. The receptionist smiled as I approached. I checked in without a problem, and she handed me my key card. "Room 18, she said. "You're actually lucky. It's a private room tonight, so you'll have it all to yourself." I thanked her and made my way upstairs. The hallway was quiet compared to the lobby. When I finally found room 18, I tapped the key card against the lock and pushed the door open. Yet something stopped me in the doorway. Someone was already inside. A guy around my age was sitting on the other bed with a book in his hands. He looked up when the door opened, just as surprised to see me as I was to see him. For a moment, we both assumed there had been some kind of mistake. Then we realized we were both assigned to the same room. He introduced himself as Nathan. After we decided to just share the room, I placed my backpack beside the empty bed and decided not to make a big deal out of it. Hostels were busy places, and mix-ups happened all the time. There was nothing about Nathan that immediately felt wrong. He was quiet, polite, and spent most of the evening reading. We exchanged the usual small talk between strangers sharing a room, but whenever I asked about him, his answers were always vague. I asked where he was from, and he smiled before mentioning a few different cities he traveled to, without ever actually answering the question. The only thing that really caught my attention was how little he owned. My backpack was stuffed to the point where the zipper barely closed. Meanwhile, Nathan had a single faded backpack resting neatly beside the bed. I never saw him unzip it, as far as I could tell. Everything he owned fit inside that worn-out backpack. After I finished unpacking, I climbed into my bed and scrolled through my phone while he continued reading. The room settled into a comfortable silence, broken only by the occasional sound of people laughing somewhere out in the hallway. After a while, Nathan closed his book and looked towards the window. "There's a place nearby that stays open pretty late," he said. "Good drinks." I thanked him, but told him I was exhausted from the flight. I planned on getting some sleep so I'd actually have energy when my friends arrived the next morning. He nodded and picked his book back up. Every now and then he turned a page, but I never actually saw him reading. Most of the time, he simply stared down at the open book, without his eyes moving across the page. A few minutes later, after the silence had settled back over the room, he mentioned it again. This time, something about the way he said it bothered me. He wasn't trying to convince me, or asking a second time because he thought I hadn't heard him. It felt more like he was waiting for a different answer. I laughed it off and apologized, telling him I was too exhausted to even keep my eyes open. He only nodded and returned to his book. Eventually, I grabbed my towel to shower and got ready to actually call it a night. When I came back from the bathroom, Nathan hadn't moved. He was sitting in exactly the same position, the same page spread open in his hands, his backpack still resting neatly beside the bed. It looked less like someone who had been relaxing for the last 20 minutes, and more like someone who had been frozen in place the entire time. I remember standing in the doorway for a second longer than I should have, trying to figure out why that bothered me so much. I'd somewhat expected him to wander downstairs for food, or check his phone, or do anything. Instead, it was almost as if the room had been paused while I was gone. I brushed the thought aside, climbed into my bed, and before long the exhaustion from traveling caught up with me. I don't know how much later it was when I woke up. The room was almost completely dark, the only light coming from a thin strip beneath the door that stretched across the floor between our beds. For a moment, I thought someone had just entered the room. Then my eyes adjusted, and I saw Nathan sitting on the edge of his bed. Our two beds sat on the opposite sides of the room, both facing the door, and from where I was laying, I could see his silhouette perfectly. His back was straight, his hands rested loosely in his lap, and he was staring towards the doorway. He wasn't reading anymore or using his phone. He was just sitting there, completely still. I reached for my phone and checked the time. 3:17 a.m. I watched him for what felt like half an hour, waiting for him to move, but he never did. The longer I looked at him, the more it felt like he had been sitting there for much longer than I had been awake. Just as I started convincing myself he had fallen asleep sitting up, he spoke out loud. "I thought you'd leave." The words were quiet, almost like he was saying them to himself, rather than to me. I didn't respond and closed my eyes, hoping he'd think I was sleeping this whole time. A few seconds passed before I opened my eyes slightly again. Nathan wasn't looking at the door anymore. He was looking directly at me. I couldn't make out his expression in the darkness, but there was something about the way he stared that made me feel like he already knew my answer. Without saying anything else, he stood up, picked up his backpack, and walked out of the door. The door clicked softly behind him. I waited for the sound of his footsteps to fade down the hallway, but they never came. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me back to sleep. When I woke up, sunlight was spilling through the window. For a second, I forgot about the night before. Then I looked towards the other bed and noticed Nathan was gone. His blanket was folded neatly, his book was missing, and his faded backpack had disappeared with him. There was nothing left behind that suggested anyone had been there at all. I started packing up my things. My friends wouldn't arrive until later that afternoon, so I planned to spend a few hours exploring the city before meeting them. As I slung my backpack across one shoulder, something on the other bed caught my eye. A bracelet was laid neatly on the mattress where Nathan had been. I picked it up, assuming he'd forgotten it in his rush to leave. The bracelet itself was simple, made from thin black strands woven together into a tight braid. At first, I actually thought it looked nice, the kind of handmade souvenir you might find in a local market. Then, my thumb brushed across the braided strands. The strands weren't smooth like thread. They were uneven, some thicker than others, with tiny fibers curling away from the pattern. And the longer I stared at it, the more certain I became. It wasn't made from string. It was made from hair. A chill ran through me as I realized, but I slipped it into my pocket before thinking about it anymore. I wanted to leave it at the front desk, just in case Nathan came back looking for it. When I reached the front desk, the same receptionist from the night before greeted me with a smile and asked how my stay had been. I hesitated before explaining that my roommate had left something behind. The moment I mentioned Nathan, her expression changed. She asked who I was talking about. Assuming she had misunderstood, I explained that the guy staying in room 18 with me had left early that morning. Instead of answering, she turned to her computer and searched the reservation system. After a moment, her face tightened. "I'm sorry," she said, "but room 18 was booked as a private room. You were the only guest assigned to it." There had been no record of Nathan ever being there. I knew I had shared the room with someone, but the longer I stood there, the stranger my own memory became. I could remember Nathan's face perfectly. I could hear his voice. Yet the details that should have been easiest to recall were missing. I couldn't remember where he said he was from, what book he had been reading, or whether I'd actually ever seen him open his backpack. I left the bracelet on the desk and walked out of the hostel without another word. When I met up with my friends later that afternoon, I tried to forget the entire thing. We spent the day exploring the city. A few times, I almost told them about Nathan, but every time I tried, the story sounded less like something that happened and more like something I had imagined. How do you explain that you spent an entire night sharing a room with someone who, according to the hostel, never even existed? Almost 2 months passed before I thought about Nathan again. One Saturday afternoon, I was cleaning my apartment when I came across the backpack I had taken on the trip. I figured I should finally empty it before using it again. As I reached into one of the smaller compartments, my fingers brushed against something I didn't recognize. I pulled it out and frowned. It was a thin, black book. For a moment, I couldn't understand why it looked so familiar. Then it hit me. Nathan had been reading it. I could picture him sitting across the room with it resting in his hands. Yet, I couldn't remember ever seeing a title. I knew I hadn't packed it. Trying to convince myself I was overreacting, I opened the cover and realized every single page inside was blank. I frowned and flipped through it again, slower this time, running my thumb over each page as though the words might suddenly appear if I looked closely enough. Yet, they never did. Just before I closed the book, a folded piece of paper slipped between the pages and landed in my lap. Someone had drawn a careful line down the center. Across the top of one column was the word left. Across the other was stayed. Beneath left were rows of tally marks, packed together until they nearly filled the page. Under stayed, there was only one line. I sat there staring at it, trying to think of any explanation that made sense. I folded the paper exactly as I'd found it, tucked it back inside the book, and carried both to my trash can. I stood there for a long time before finally turning away. Sometimes, I wonder what those columns were meant to represent. I think about Nathan asking me to leave the hostel with him that night, and no matter how hard I try not to, my eyes always go back to the single tally mark, understayed. Thank you for watching. This story was actually inspired by a real story because a similar scenario had happened to one of my friends. Bad news is that he had a terrible experience, but good news is I had new inspiration for a story. So goodbye for now, but not forever.